مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. بعد 3 سنوات من الإغلاق قررت الصين إلغاء جميع إجراءات الحجر الصحي المتعلقة بفيروس كورونا اعتبارا من 8 يناير المقبل، وبينها متطلبات المسافرين للدخول للبلاد في خطوة أولى لإلغاء نظام صفر كوفيد الذي أغلق البلاد عن بقية العالم. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة ينضم إلينا البروفيسور جينس لوندغرين، أستاذ الأمراض الفيروسية والمعدية في جامعة كوبنهاغن في الدنمارك. بروفيسور جينس، شكرا لك للانضمام إلينا.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
الصين إذن تلغي جميع الإجراءات المتعلقة بكورونا، فيما وسائل الإعلام الغربية تتحدث عن ملايين الإصابات الجديدة هذا الشهر فقط. ما الذي يحدث هناك؟
Well, as you know, China was pursuing a zero-tolerance strategy until pretty much November of this year. And therefore, the Chinese population has not been exposed to the virus, and as it appears as well, have not been really very aggressive in the vaccine rollout policy. So a large proportion of the population remains unvaccinated and without exposure to the virus. And now they are giving up on that zero tolerance policy, and as a consequence of that, see that what you can say is the second wave. They had the first wave in January and February 2020, but since then there's been very little coronavirus in China until now. So the virus have ample ability, therefore, to create a huge wave in the Chinese population.
هل يجب أن نخاف ونتحسب عالميا لزيادة الإصابات بهذا الشكل في الصين؟
Yeah, no, I have to say I'm mostly worried about the Chinese public health because obviously going through a wave of this type in a fairly under-vaccinated population would create a lot of morbidity and a lot of mortality in the Chinese population. So I guess that's my main concern, and I hope that if there's anything the rest of the world can do to help China in this critical situation, hopefully that could be sorted out so we can help our Chinese friends and colleagues. In terms of what the rest of the world is facing as a consequence of this huge epidemic in China at the moment, we don't really know, to be quite honest. We have obviously a number of different subvariants of the virus since the pandemic started in December 2019. The latest of those subtypes is what we call the Omicron variant that was identified in November 21 and have essentially taken over from all other of the virus variants that were circulating until then. And that virus has continued to sort of evolve itself into different subtypes, you can say, of Omicron. And since there will be so many infections in China at the moment, one would expect that evolution of the virus will continue to be accelerated, as it does also outside of China, to be mindful, because it's certainly not the only place in the world where there is ongoing infection, for sure. But obviously, since it's so compressed at the moment in China, one would need to be very aware of potential new types of viruses that evolved as a consequence of this, and therefore that needs to be monitored very carefully.
مسؤول في الصحة العالمية قال إن تخفيف الصين لقيود السفر يشير بشكل أساسي إلى نهاية سياسة صفر كوفيد. هل فشلت تلك السياسة التي اعتمدتها الصين؟
I mean, it was obviously a policy that the Chinese authorities decided to pursue. So it's really them that needs to explain or evaluate whether it has failed. I mean, what is quite clear is that the rest of the population of the world did not follow such a zero tolerance policy, and certainly not for so long periods of time as was done in China. And it has been a little bit unclear why they continue to pursue the zero tolerance policy, because it had so major implications. You talk about travel restrictions, but obviously as part of the zero tolerance strategy, you needed to do huge lockdown just for one or two viruses in major cities that we have heard about in China as well, that have been obviously really, really difficult to deal with for people who live there. And obviously also economy, production and so forth have had a major hit as a consequence of that. So, but other countries pursued a zero tolerance strategy early on in the pandemic, countries like Australia and New Zealand. But they gave up on that in the spring of 21 because they could see that they needed an exit strategy. And that is really, I think, what we have been debating internationally was, in China, what was the exit strategy for zero tolerance? Because at some point, what is happening now needs to happen. I mean, you can't continue to have 1.4 billion people in a country that is completely isolated from the rest of the world. What needed to be done in order to lift the zero tolerance? And I have not heard that any sort of strategy of, with focus on public health to explain what was the exit strategy. And there's been a lot of advice given that once you lift your zero tolerance strategy, that before you do that, you need to have a very comprehensive vaccine rollout campaign in order to boost immunity of the population so they can better take once they get infected with the virus. Unfortunately, that was not done. And I believe that's why the situation is as dire as it is at the moment in China.
كيف ستواجه الصين المرحلة المقبلة في ظل تفشي الجائحة وتخفيف القيود؟ وكيف ستكون تبعات ذلك على المرافق الصحية في البلاد؟
Well, I mean, we have very good information now on how these waves behave, and it takes probably in the range between 3 to 4 months before the first wave is over with. At that time, the projections is that around 800 to 900 million Chinese people will be infected over that 3 or 4 month period. What will happen after that, of course, is that given the fact that there are so many people who's infected, that will, of course, stimulate immunity of the population to a much higher degree than what was true, just 2 months ago. And as a consequence, although the coronavirus will not disappear, certainly not from China, not from any country in the world, it will be more manageable after that period of time. But over the next 3 months or something of that nature, there will be this first wave will have major public health implications within China.
هل اللقاح الصيني أقل فاعلية أم عدد الملقحين في الصين هو أقل منه عن باقي دول العالم؟
That's a good question. We don't have a lot of good information about how the vaccines that was produced in China, how they face up with vaccines elsewhere, because they haven't been done, the careful studies to compare them. But the perception is that they may have been less effective than some of the mRNA vaccines that has been used quite successfully in many places of the world. I think that's certainly one issue. I think the second issue in terms of uptake of the vaccine, whatever vaccine there was available, I can certainly appreciate that many Chinese citizens would have the opinion, if there is a zero tolerance policy in China, and as a consequence there is no virus, why do I need to be vaccinated against a virus who is not here? Right? So the incentive to actually be vaccinated may not have been that strong. But obviously now they have changed the policy so quickly. So and obviously what would have been, I think, preferable would have been to take an intermediate period where we say we are planning to lift the zero tolerance strategy, say in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, and we will use this period to vaccinate our population. There's been offering to also receive vaccinations from outside of China if they were shorter vaccines and also good vaccines that could have been used effectively during that period. But they jumped immediately without that sort of in-between vaccine scale-up period, unfortunately.
طيب في هذا السياق هل يمكن أن تلجأ الصين إلى اللقاحات الغربية التي لا زالت تصر حتى الآن على رفض استخدامها؟
Well, I mean, that's truly a political question for Chinese authorities that I can't answer. I'm an independent expert, and I would say that we have.
لكنه سؤال صحي كذلك، إذا ما كانت هذه اللقاحات الغربية متوفرة وذات فعالية عالية، لما لا؟
Well, I mean, logically, one would think that the vaccines that has been used very effectively in many countries and in millions of people, that one would probably have preferred to use that as well in this situation. But the arguments for not doing it and not taking up, because there has been offers, I'm aware that offers has been made to China to receive potentially mRNA vaccines or go into a negotiation around that. But the explanations for that, I really can't speculate. It's clearly a political choice rather than a public health choice, if you can see what I mean.
سؤالي هنا أيضا ربما له بعد اقتصادي لكنه مرتبط بالبعد الصحي. عندما خففت الصين من قيود السفر مباشرة شهدنا أثرا إيجابيا على الأسواق الآسيوية. تعتقد أن هذا هو السبب الذي دفع الصين إلى إزالة هذه القيود؟
I mean, I'm a public health expert and not an economist. I do notice that the stock exchange markets have increased in Asia because there is now a normalization of interactions with China, which obviously is a huge country that controls a lot of the economy in that section of the world and pretty much globally. So I can appreciate that. Whether that has been the motivation to go so quickly from zero tolerance to now just let it ride? Good question. Maybe it is. If that's really the argument, that's obviously a very cynical argument, you can say. Because I mean, the suffering that happens as a consequence of this is, by the best of my understanding, pretty significant. A lot of people is very sick. The hospitals are overwhelmed in China, and there's also, as one would expect, unfortunately, a lot of people who's dying as a consequence of this. So that's I believe that's at least what I can say. And it's not unexpected what we see. This, as I mentioned before, we can pretty much calculate this. What happens if the policy changed? That was done already early on in the 2022. What would happen once China lifted the zero tolerance strategy and did nothing other than just let the virus roll? And in fact, large proportion of the population. And exactly as would therefore have been predicted is therefore now happening.
بما أننا بنهاية العام، سؤالي الأخير سيكون عن كورونا بشكل عام. هل ستكون سنة 2023 سنة نهاية الفيروس؟
No, that's a good question. I appreciate why you ask that. I mean, obviously, we need to be really cautious of what we say here because the virus has changed itself on numerous occasions over the last 2 to 3 years, and therefore is quite unpredictable. However, I would say that most countries, and now also China, is coming into a situation where the virus is available. It's transmitting within the population, but the impact on critical infrastructure is much less intense in other countries now. than just, for example, a year ago. And that all is explained by the fact that the immunity against this new virus have increased all over the world. And now also, as we just talked about, that will also be true now for China. So I do see 2023 as the year where it will be WHO who will declare that the pandemic is over, in the sense that this virus is no longer a major health to public health. It will still be here, so it's a virus that we will not get rid of, but we will have instruments. In what I'm talking about here is particularly vaccines that can help us to deal with the virus, as we deal with other respiratory viruses like influenza. So I hope that 2023 is the year where this last pandemic here can be declared over with. And then obviously, as a reminder as well, that we need to be then prepared for when the next pandemic comes, because there will be a pandemic after this one. Exactly what the cause of that pandemic is it influenza? Is it coronavirus? Is it the third virus that creates this? But these things will happen periodically to global society. And I think what is really the key lesson learned from this pandemic is that everybody around the globe needs to be aware that this can happen and needs to have preparatory steps in place. So when it happens, that we help each other globally to deal with that new threat that comes up. And hopefully that will be also 2023, the year where we see a global consolidation of the world being able to build better collaborative infrastructure around the world to deal with future pandemics.
بروفيسور جينس لوندغرين، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
You're welcome.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.